Which one's the best crypto asset? Well, Bitcoin's the best crypto asset. Okay. What's the second best? There is no second best. There's no second best crypto asset. There's a crypto asset. It's called Bitcoin, right? Right? There's no second best, okay?
Welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show with me, Dale Warburton. It's a weekly podcast on why Bitcoin matters and what makes it fundamentally different to every other crypto token in existence. I've seen firsthand how crypto really works, and my mission is to speak to the brightest minds on earth to help ordinary people distill crypto fact from fiction. Because as Lynn Alden says, and it's spot on, those that conflate Bitcoin and crypto simply don't understand either. All right, Mr. Gaz Larking, welcome.
How are you, Dale?
I'm doing very, very well. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show, a new show, episode 4, and really stoked to have you here, Gary. I think I've always enjoyed our chats, whether it's at the Bush Bash or whether it's at the Brisbane meetup, and I reckon you're probably one of those underappreciated voices. You do a bit of shit posting here and there on Twitter, but I think you've got a lot of sort of knowledge bombs that you're dropping us from time to time. And I thought it'd be a great opportunity to get you on and perhaps sow some of your seeds of wisdom on us.
Well, you're too kind. I try to keep things upbeat and interesting on Twitter. I try not to be too, how would you put it, negative. But, you know, for me, it's all about everybody doing their little bit. I'm a sort of firm believer in the whole world Satoshi, and we just do things in our own little way. It's a really bizarre thing, the way it works. And so some people work in Bitcoin, some people write books. I do fiat mining and just happen to love the space, all the tentacles and little rabbit holes around the edges of it. It's endlessly fascinating.
100%. So let's, for those who are sort of not familiar with the legend of Gaz, give us a quick little spin around your sort of background, and then you can kind of lead into your Bitcoin origin story and how you were orange pilled.
Yeah, sure. Look, there's no major headline story as far as I'm concerned. I'm not a published author. I'm not, a celebrity, as it were, in the space. I'm just a guy who happens to have spent a lot of time around Bitcoin and just love talking about it. I could take you a bit through sort of how I got to that place. But basically, I like to surround myself with Bitcoiners because of reasons we'll probably talk about. So probably get into that just a fraction, I suppose. Like, my background is in, I did accounting and finance at uni in Australia, and also did computer systems engineering. So that probably stood me in reasonable stead just from a background point of view, to have some idea about what Bitcoin was. But then it got into a lot to do with investing, value investing particularly, and just reading everything I could on the topic and following people who really knew a lot on the topic. So all of that was the background in my head when all of a sudden a friend of mine challenged me to answer the question, what is Bitcoin? And it was almost like a dare. So I wasn't really orange pilled. It just happened. Explain that. And the rest, they say, is history.
Wow.
That's pretty much it in a nutshell. And where it goes from here is anyone's guess. But I settle with, Bush bashes and, Twitter and, recently the Sydney Bitcoin Alive, which was just fantastic.
100%. So, all right. So I'm going to use a phrase that I find very irritating, but it's relevant here. Let's double click on that, zoom in a bit.
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's irritating. Yeah. So let's double click a little bit on your background, because I think people might find it quite interesting how, okay, you've got that sort of you've got that accounting, and then you've got the sort of computer science pieces that enable you to see the engineering behind Bitcoin and how this was created. You probably had a rough understanding of the financial system, and you had, you know, all the different asset classes, and the relative risk reward, liquidity, etc., and the role each of those played in the broader financial system. I suppose then then you've got that value investor slant, which sort of actually resonates with me. I wasn't picking stocks, but I could certainly see the value in that approach. And yeah, how did Bitcoin fit into that framework when you've got, you know, you've got bonds, stocks, property, you know, all the other asset classes? And you're thinking, well, okay, this is interesting. Friends dare me to start digging. You sort of start uncovering it as we do. We go down the rabbit hole. And then you're like, well, how does this fit in my mental model? So like, what's your mental model around at that point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's exactly how I approached it. One of the really good approaches, which were done with a lot of the people who I sort of respected in the value investing space, is that they would look at any particular stock and they would say the investment thesis. It's like there'd be basically it's an investment thesis is what they would call it. And they would say, why are we interested in this in the first place? And it's things like competitive advantage, things like, for example, a stock, the financials, all of the PE ratios and the debt to equity ratios, and you know, the standard metrics, price earning ratios. And you sort of have that in the back of your mind, and then you've got other things like risks and when we'd sell. And it just puts something tangible in your mind before you do anything at all. So anyone listening to this should probably distinguish that from trading, which is completely not that. Yeah. It's not technical analysis. It's not just sitting there. And I think one of the great fallacies or mistakes that people make is feeling that they need to be doing something. You know, because when you get into the value investing space, there is a lot of sayings that come along and you pick up along the way. And one of the better ones I ever came across, you know, apologies for quoting the great Warren Buffett, but, you know, he would say something like, if you had 10 transactions to make in your life, you'd really put a lot of thought into each of those 10. And contrast that with, say, a Robin Hood type situation where people are just clicking madly based on, and, you know, some people do all right on that, but generally they get burned. And so that was sort of the lens, the framework that I looked at, you know, both stocks and certainly the framework that I looked at Bitcoin from. And there was a lot of books that came along the way, you know, and you made some reference to sort of a background, but like if people aren't very far down the rabbit hole and they do have some degree of economics background or formal education, they soon find that they need to unlearn large portions of what they have been taught at uni. It gives you some indication, but largely that's Keynesian economics. And as we may get to if we have time, a lot of that goes straight out the window when you start looking at Bitcoin.
100%, yeah.
So there was a lot of framework and reference that I had in my mind when I first looked at Bitcoin. And yeah, we could explore some of those, but I think you get the idea. So I challenged myself to do something like that, an investment thesis and risks and when we'd sell, and try and do an investment thesis on Bitcoin.
Brilliant. Yeah, that makes so much sense. It actually resonates so much with me in particular because, you know, I'm not a technical person either. And I suppose the first thing you would say that I think you said, which was really, you know, on point, is there's a distinction between investing and trading. So we're not talking about trading. That's a different game. That's looking at charts. And that's not the game one plays. I mean, you know, sure, you can make a little bit of money here and there, potentially, if you're lucky, but 99% of the time, over long periods of time, you're going to be beaten by those who just sit on their hands. It reminds me of
exactly.
There's like a Warren Buffett quote says something along the lines of like, you know, never interrupt compound interest or something to that effect, because it's like in a given calendar year, something like 80 or 90% of the year's returns are compressed within 5 trading days, something to that effect. So if you're literally out of the market for those 5 days, your performance relative just to an index is dramatically worse off. So, you know, sitting on your hands, I think, is the biggest challenge for a lot of people. They think they got to get active. And this is where, like, there's a strange link, and I haven't actually really made this before prior to us speaking, but it's kind of like value investing is very much about picking something that has good fundamentals at a good price and then just doing nothing. And Bitcoin's kind of similar. It's, you know, it's kind of like,
exactly.
Yeah,
this
you
is
just do nothing with it. That's the point.
There's so many reasons why I like Bitcoin. And most people who I know, the further they go along the journey, you know, they spend their whole time largely defending their, or trying to find the faults in their thesis. What am I missing here? You know, I've arrived at these conclusions, and it never ceases to amaze me, some of the people who are attracted to this space. It's a constant theme throughout, where I'm still trying to put my finger on the fact or the common thread throughout. What is it that attracts people to this space and makes them just not be superficial, but all in? Just not necessarily financially all in, but just in terms of interest. Just there's few things that are more fascinating at this point in time. But it depends how you're wired. It depends what interests you. And
that's spot on. Yeah.
And that's always the question that I find, because they come from all walks of life. And there's no finer case of it than just recently at the Bitcoin Alive in Sydney. Just some of the people who you find yourself talking to, and you just don't know, like, what in the world could have attracted this individual who you don't know. But universally, you find yourself getting on like a house on fire, because they're probably thinking the same thing. Quite intimidating going to your first one. That wasn't it was certainly the first like big Australian one, but it's certainly not my first Bitcoin meetup. But yeah, I do remember going back to the first meetup that I went to. I had no idea. I went there on my own. I was in Brisbane, and yeah, no idea what kind of people you're going to meet there. And you know, it's like you're finding your long lost tribe. You know, because they're just, you know, on the same wavelength. They just get it. And so, yeah, it's so to answer that question, I'm not sure what the common thread is through. The best I can find is an inquiring mind, and that's probably where it starts. To some extent, an engineering mindset, I've probably found. That's largely due to probably more males that seem to be in the space than there are females, by my observations. Which is sort of consistent with a lot of the kind of engineering places that I've worked over the period. They tend to be more male oriented, but, you know, likely to change. And you know, females got plenty to offer in the space. There's plenty of pretty clearly females around too. So yeah. But anyway, I mean,
it's interesting what you're saying, because, you know, when I think about, and I've had this chat recently, like, what's a thread between us all? We're very different in many, many ways. We come from different backgrounds. And like you, I've created a framework, and I put together an investment framework, because we come for the sort of gains and we stay for the philosophy and the everything else that Bitcoin represents. I think the common thread, as you say, is certainly an inquiring mind. I would also add to that a questioning mind. I guess people who've wanted to explore things further, because you can go and have a conversation with a Bitcoiner about the media, and you know that this person has already probably thought a little bit about, to what extent do the incentives within the media complex drive the content that I'm viewing, and which financial interests are pushing this? We kind of, and that's the kind of discussion. It's just one example that I can think of where I would feel comfortable walking up to any Bitcoiner and say, you know, XYZ about media, what are your thoughts? And it wouldn't be met with this sort of like, you're a bit of a conspiracy theorist. What are you reading? It's kind of like, if you don't just, it's effectively people don't just swallow mainstream narratives that are pushed by some sort of corporate agenda, and whether it's food, whether it's media, whatever the case may be, we just ask questions. And that's what makes it so great for me, I find, when I engage with Bitcoiners. And to your point, you walk into a meetup and you're like, don't know who the hell you're going to meet. I mean, I went to a bush bash before I went to an actual meetup in Brisbane. So I just rock up in this town, sort of 8-hour drive from Brisbane, and I'm like, I don't even know a single soul here. And my wife says, like, you're a madman. Like, I could never do that. You're just driving to the middle of nowhere to go meet people.
A lot of justification to a comment like that, and a lot of people take a leap of faith. But for anyone listening to this, strongly recommend, because I'll just expand slightly on the journey, because from that point where somebody challenged me to answer the question, what is Bitcoin? I just thought, all right, well, how would I go about answering that? So I sort of went back to first principles, and you do what you do. You might Google it a bit. I thought, I might read some books on this, see what I can find. And you go down that path, and then I discovered podcasts, and so I thought, oh, that's interesting. And through that, I discovered, the people who are on these podcasts seem to communicate with one another, not just in the podcast, but offline. And I wasn't on Twitter prior to that at all, wasn't interested. And I thought I might just see what that's all about, see what people have got to say. I might learn something there. And then that whole universe opens up. And that's what leads you to the people, in real life. And that's it. And that's where you're sort of not quite sure how it's going to play out. But yeah, look, it's just the most amazing journey. And I can't see it ending anytime soon. It's so all encompassing. In fact, it gets to now a point where, I just, in the last weekend gone, you have a weekend away with, some friends you've known for a long, long time, and none of whom are into Bitcoin. And you're sort of there. It's just interesting seeing the sort of stuff they're talking about, and it's reasonably superficial, I suppose, and that can be fun to a point. But usual story, you just sort of want to start talking about the meat and potatoes.
Totally.
But not everyone wants to be doing that, and that's where those the meetups are just so fantastic, because it's therapy for a lot of folk, because they often can't talk to their wives or significant others about it. And similar to the example I just gave, you kind of get the eye roll when you raise it. And so when you can actually find people who are just as enthusiastic, if not more so, and you might know what I'm talking about when you say, if not more so,
yeah,
or when I say that. So, when you walk into a room and some guy just starts going hard on elliptic curve cryptography, and you'll just say, whoa, just okay. I won't name the individual, but certainly you just think, okay. But it's just one particular rabbit hole, which isn't necessarily my cup of tea, but like so many other things, you have a superficial understanding of what that is, but, and go to the point that interests you. But you don't necessarily need to know everything there is to know about it.
Exactly.
And that's what keeps me interested in this, is that there's so many different rabbit holes. And, we could explore that, but you probably know what they are. And
yeah, 100%.
Depends on the scope of this particular conversation.
This isn't Breed Love and Sailor's 4-hour series. And
that's the thing. That's how far you could go.
You can really go deep, whether it's cryptography, whether it's energy, whether it's sort of whether it's the monetary side of things, the game theory, the whole lot there.
I'll tell you something interesting that just happened at the Bitcoin Alive just a week or so ago. So Knut Svanholm was there, and I've read his books, and I just a really good brain, in the space, just an incredible thinker. And there he was physically outside. And so, how you going? I couldn't help introduce myself. He was very great. He couldn't believe people recognizing him and all that sort of stuff because, it's new for everybody. It's someone been in the space longer.
Yeah.
But anyway, he was there. And so I had a good chat with him. And later on, there are some people inside who didn't know anything about Bitcoin at all. Just these people, and what a space to go to where you just no idea, hadn't much read anything, and just, they wanted to know what's Bitcoin. Interesting little loop closed there, back to the original question. And so I'm here thinking about an answer to this. And who should come walking past but Knut? And so I said, Knut, perhaps you've got something to offer. He's just about to go on for his keynote, by the way. And but to his credit, he decided to talk to these people for a good 5 minutes or so about his views, which incidentally, his answer was really good, which was basically, it's a fixed set of rules, an unchanging set of rules, which I just loved in so many contexts. If you really listen to that and think about that in the context of the world around you, that is an incredible statement. But I won't elaborate on that. But it just sort of struck me that there's a fellow, an amazing brain in the space. And, he's sitting there and he's talking to these people who hadn't read the Bitcoin Standard. They virtually knew nothing about Bitcoin. And it just blew me away that there's such an advanced brain there willing to just be humble and talk to people and bring them along the journey. And I sort of draw a great deal from that. And, but anyway, just a little anecdote.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what he says is spot on. I often tell people we live in a ruler-based society, whereas Bitcoin's a rules-based order, and no one gets to change the rules. And it's open, it's voluntary, there's no permission required, and it's actually fundamentally fair. I think you mentioned earlier, like, Bitcoin was gaining momentum, and the more and more kind of, bush bashers we go to, the meetups we go to, the people we meet, the more bullish we become. And you can sort of become this, living in this echo chamber and drinking your own Kool-Aid and, creating heroes, which is not something that we typically do in Bitcoin, but whether it's the likes of Saylor or whoever. And I'm wondering what you think is potentially the biggest risk for Bitcoin. And I mean, realistically, we're talking here that people have this idea that Bitcoin will be $1 million, $10 million at some point in the future. What do you think is the biggest risk or biggest risks to Bitcoin that exist today?
Yeah, sort of ranking them is an interesting one. But you always need to think about that. I recall right at the start, I said about an investment thesis, risks and when I'd sell. So you need to give thought to those risks. And it's a topic which has come up quite a lot in a lot of discussions. At some sort of technical failure is always a consideration. We can never discount that. As to whether that's likely to happen or not, well, the longer it goes and works, and it's just this strong pulse signal every day, every minute, every 10 minutes, that's less likely, but it's still there. We can talk about government regulation. That's an ever-changing quicksand. The beauty of Bitcoin is that it's global. And when I think about risk, I think about comparative risk. And this is always an interesting topic because any sort of alternative place where you would put your value needs to be considered in terms of the risks that it attracts for, real estate, stocks, bonds. We can talk about all those things, but the question was about Bitcoin. So regulation, regulation in what jurisdiction? It's a global asset, so it's obviously related to where you are. Now, what could governments do in relation to this? They could do things like the equivalent of the 6102 executive order in the US, which was in 1933, where they wanted people to surrender their gold. And they basically said, do that. Now, all right, it's much harder to do that with Bitcoin, but KYC Bitcoin is something which means that there is traceability on this, just harder to enforce. So, and an Australian version, a US version, or whatever country you happen to live in is entirely possible. So you need to give some consideration to that. I recently gave thought to a possibility of a compelling requirement for governments to tell you to disclose your holdings of Bitcoin. This is a rule. Now, at this point in Australia, you don't need to do that. So that could be, but the KYC aspect means they implicitly know that, but you don't need to declare that each year that goes by. So that's something else. Is that a risk? Just a potential database access, a potential coercion point that could happen down the track. And, you know, we can't lose sight of the fact that one of the main reasons that we love Bitcoin is because it's a self-custodied asset. And, you know, keep your hands off it. No one's getting to this. This is absolutely as safe as it gets. That's one of the things that I just love about it. So anything that could potentially compromise that, such as what I just mentioned, you'd have to consider to be risks.
Yeah.
But look, other things apart from that, I'm not. One thing I think people do gloss over a lot is the price. Now, people in the space say, you know what, it's the less interesting thing about it. And I'm the first to agree that. But everybody really needs to be honest about the fact that it does have a major implication on so many things in relation to the space. You know, if you've got a protracted bear market that lasts for a long, long time, you're not going to attract investment in companies building new products and development to make it bigger and better. You're going to have a lot more. You think about your average Bitcoin owner. You know, they've got a partner. They've got somebody who they need to basically face the music and say, how's that thing going?
Yeah.
You know, how's your little Bitcoin thing going? You know, isn't it down 85%? Are you going to bail on that yet? Risk of divorce, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, hello, am I wrong? Is that not a risk?
100%.
It's amazing, you know, and it might be the most fascinating thing known to mankind, but you can't just live in a bubble and just expect all those people who don't understand it to go along with that. It's unreasonable. So
it's a great point.
I don't know that we can completely dismiss price, although I think we all agree it is a little bit non-interesting. Yet, yeah, most of us have an awareness of what it is.
Yes.
And it does have a lot of implications. So
yeah, it would be disingenuous for us to say that it's irrelevant. Perhaps in the short run, you know, most of us are, so I tend to say we're playing 5-day cricket, we're not playing T20 here. So I'm thinking a decade. But like realistically, in a decade, if Bitcoin is still where it is now, I would probably be pretty disappointed because, you know, I would have said like it has probably, I mean, it's definitely resilient, but you'd say there must have been some significant sort of mud thrown at it for a prolonged period. They must have shut off the on-ramps and off-ramps. They must have, you know, essentially done, you know, that sort of 6102 type order and said, declare your Bitcoin. And so some countries will stick their hands up and say, we're kind of Bitcoin refugees come across here. And so, you know, maybe, you know, you'd have to start deciding, is this going to be my country? And then you say to your partner, I want to run with my Bitcoin. And he or she might say, not for me. So there is that, and it is quite interesting what you say. I tend to believe that there isn't anything that can really stop it, but there's a lot that can hamper its adoption.
It can influence it.
Yeah.
And the purists amongst us would probably start saying, oh, that's interesting. Who cares about the fiat price? You know, why don't you just trade goods for Bitcoin and have a Bitcoin circular economy and all that kind of stuff, which is noble. And I believe where it's going to go. I firmly believe that in due course, those people who just ignore will all of a sudden, it's going to be a very expensive proposition, if indeed it's available at all. If you've had a real good look at the accumulation and the available Bitcoin on exchanges, it's just dropping all the time, and it's going to drop even further in approximately 365 with the halvening or the halfening, depending on whether you read that. So, the thesis here is have a look at the world around you. Have a look at what's going on with fiat currencies. I just saw that the US debt ceiling got raised again, another 1.2 trillion, as was always inevitable.
Yeah.
I just saw another bank failing today, First Republic, on the back of, Silicon Valley, the Signature. Don't even talk about Credit Suisse. It's like a few dominoes that are falling here, and like we don't want to see that, but there's some pretty intelligent people in the Bitcoin space, and when intelligent people speak, I've always been of the view it pays sense to listen. Makes sense to listen. So someone like Greg Foss, 30 years as a bond trader, he'd sit there and say, look at the credit, look at the CDS, the credit default swaps. If you really want to know what's going on, what's going to influence equity or even survival of an entity, just have a look and see what's the price of their credit.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's the canary in the coal mine. That's telling you what the market says. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And this is just more things that just are insanely good about this space, because some of the people that are involved are so insanely talented, and they've got their own individual backgrounds, but they're more than happy most of the time to share their views with the general spirit and principle of trying to foster Bitcoin adoption. And you learn so much if you've got a mind to do that. And I certainly do. So, so I see all that. And back to what we were saying, when that whole trend's going on, sure, the price might be depressed. They might find ways to manipulate it, Sam Bankman-Fried style, start rehypothecating and doing paper Bitcoin, and have rogue exchanges that are, selling paper Bitcoin. But, keep it in cold storage.
Yeah, it's not difficult to avoid those risks. And I heard something very interesting today when people talk about the price. It's like, if you start a dollar cost averaging, which we all recommend people do, at the top, all the way to today, you'd be up something like 18%. So, what has gone up 18% since November 21? Maybe some stocks and things like that, but you think to yourself, if that's not evidence that dollar cost averaging is a great way to get into Bitcoin, I'm not sure what is. All right, so just to sort of go back a step and just talk a little bit about the macro context. One of the things that I'm seeing at the moment is that there are some really strong tailwinds for Bitcoin. You were talking earlier about the bank failures. And I think even ordinary people are now starting to come to the realization that the number in their bank account is not necessarily reflective of actual money that's there. That if everyone simultaneously decided to go and grab their cash, they'd only have like 4% of it, at least here in Australia, at best. And so that sort of, for me, gets the discussion, or at least the thought going, like, what is this? And I think you're seeing things are breaking, sort of at the fringes. You see the UK gilt market had that situation last year where they had to take out a whole bunch of leverage on their bonds because the returns were so pedestrian, and they had to juice it up to make sure they could honor the actual pensions of those who've been contributing all their lives. And so when you look at that and you see this sort of financial system and its weaknesses being exposed almost by the day, do you feel like there's this increased momentum and this almost inevitability that mainstream will eventually get it and they'll go, here's a solution? Or do you think it's kind of it's more of the same?
Yeah, look, I mean, okay, so you're quite right. 100% agree that there's a lot of macro tailwinds that are behind Bitcoin. And this is why when I look at the lens that I look at this through, and let's face it, I mean, it's typically only people who are only down the rabbit hole that really watch this space. If you're only superficially interested in it, in Bitcoin, you wouldn't really know much about what's going on in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Costa Rica, in large, like what's recently happened in Mexico, so across South America, and what's going on in Africa, and some of this stuff. And the reason I mentioned a lot of that stuff is because you talk to your average person in Australia, and they're not interested. Why would they be? So let's just think about what they are interested in. All right, you made reference to some stuff about bank failures. None of those have happened in Australia. In the US, yes, very much so. Folks might be questioning the whole nature of, I've heard of this fractional reserve thing. I wonder what that actually means. Now, if you've got a central bank, such as the US Fed, which is artificially making depositors whole, yet absolutely sending equity holders onto the rocks and saying you're washed up, then I'm not sure what message that sends to the actual people with money in the bank, apart from the fact that you need to find another bank. However, I'm firmly of the view, and one of the things I learned very early in this space is the moment you put money into a bank account, you get an IOU for that money. And if you look at the fine print on the account, it says, well, it's now the bank's money, and they will do everything within all reasonable efforts to give money back to you, but it's not your money any longer. And
like
that,
Celsius, like FTX, like all of them.
Well, yeah, and I mean, yeah, but they're sort of in the crypto space, those ones. But I'm talking about just a straight bank account.
Oh,
I'm
yes.
talking about going to a Westpac here, or a Chase in the US, or, Barclay over in the UK, or whatever. It's not your money. And this is one of the key distinctions in terms of Bitcoin being a bearer instrument, unlike anything else. I mean, even today, I listened to a fantastic keynote address that Jack Mallers did to US Congress, where he was explaining to them how money works. It was a work of art. But one of the key takeaways is this is a bearer instrument, as opposed to, he used the expression, I love this one. He said, I have never once had a US dollar. They've never let me into the US Fed to actually go have one. I've got all these IOUs all over the place that bounce around between intermediaries, but with Bitcoin, I have this in my possession. And that is so different to the rest of all of that. But back to the macro stuff that you were talking about. In first world countries, the things that they would outwardly see are inflation, the price of things going up. All right. I'm a big believer in the fact that the absolute, which is Austrian Economics 101. Again, nothing they teach you in uni. But, once you go down the Bitcoin world, you learn about Austrian economics and the fact that governments printing money causes inflation. It's quite simple. If you are a shareholder in a company and the company issues 100 share certificates, each one worth $1, great, you've got 1 on 100 of the value of the company. If they then issue another 900, you've all of a sudden got 1 on 1,000. They've totally diluted your holdings and it's worth a lot less. That's exactly what happens when they print money. And that mathematically is inevitable to be happening. And that's what causes inflation. And try explaining that to people. I mean, they superficially get it when somebody scratches their head about building companies going out of business, but they're still doing things the way they used to do it, which is basically costing up a job. And this is what the cost of the materials are going to be, cost of the labor and fixed price, bingo. But when that all changes someone's got to pay the piper. And this is what happens when the rules of the game change. Remember, full circle back to what is Bitcoin?
Mm.
It's an unchanging set of rules. There's a lot in that, because if you keep adding in new units in a completely random schedule, for example, to bail out a systematically important bank, and then even worse, when they get to pick and choose on what's important and what's not, pick winners and losers, that means, again, the rules are extremely random. So all of this is all about risk. We speak about risk. And when you analyze it, at least the way I analyze it, I see less risk here than I see in other places, in any other option that you can be putting your money. What's better to store your value? So again, in a first world country, why would anyone care? And what is it that's going to stop the progression in a country like Australia? It will be inflation getting out of hand, and it gets a sliding scale on exactly what represents out of hand. But you already see it with people scratching their heads and wondering when it's all going to stop. And that's already way past the tipping point in a lot of the other countries I already mentioned. Argentina, classic example. Like literally, they need something to actually trade with, because the peso is worth nothing. And so they clamber for dollars. They might or might not be available, often not. What are they going to use? Beads? You know, I mean, this is literally what goes on in reality. And you would know from various places you've been about how that works in other countries as well.
There we go. Absolutely.
So,
I think,
you know, I mean, but it's harder. It's a harder sell in Australia.
Yes.
And perhaps in the US, because folks, they're going to be the last to get it.
It's true.
Sadly.
You know, I suppose the way I tend to try and explain it to people is to say that all fiat currency is like a melting ice cube, and the rate at which it turns to water, there's a term there, melts, it depends on where you are, really, right? So in Argentina, that's sort of annually, the ice cube is cutting in half. Whereas here in Australia, we might say 7%.
I think it's more than that now.
We know that it's more in reality.
Yeah.
I think this is official stuff, and effectively what that tells me, and what I say to people is, you know, I use the rule of 72. So your purchasing power at 7% is being cut in half every 10 years. So what's the incentive to save? There's none. So what do? You stick it in property. What happens to property? It goes to the roof. And then what happens? People start whining. I can't afford property. Well, do you know why? Because they've artificially pumped this thing up. So what do? Oh, we'll give 10,000 people a first home buyers thing. Oh, do you know what we'll do? Negative gearing. We'll make it, you know, favorable tax treatment here, there, and everywhere. And we have to have a system with all these rules that are actually pretty arbitrary, at the whim of rulers. And here with Bitcoin, we have a system. We've got 21 million. We know exactly how many be created all the time, and nobody can change it. You can go and create your own Bitcoin if you want. So for us, it looks like a very low risk trade. For other people, I think if you haven't been orange pilled or, you know, sort of gone down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I think it still represents something that is quite risky. And I'd say those that have spent 100 hours in Bitcoin, understanding it, learning it, speaking to people, it's difficult to see. I don't think there's people who go back from there, who go, nah, I'm not bullish anymore. Yeah.
I've never met anybody who's actually properly looked at Bitcoin, who's actually gone back. I've never come across anyone who, but I have definitely come across people who have superficially looked at Bitcoin, or who have, you know, traded, because it doesn't matter what it is. It could be, you know, pork bellies, or it could be, you know, soybean futures or whatever. No one cares. It's just something that they can make a margin on. And fair enough, there's a lot of traders in this world, and good luck to them. Hopefully they do well. But people who kind of go down the rabbit hole, they rarely come back. And there's a reason for that, because you cannot answer the question, what is Bitcoin, without answering the question, what is money? And once you ask that question, then you need to look at the world around you. Now, to your illustration a moment ago, there's two factors which are implicit in what you said to do with property. And both of them variables that are changed by a central bank. One is the supply issuance of money, which, as we said, is inflationary. The other is interest rates. And both of those things are variables. And so we talk about an unchanging set of rules. Well, there's two pretty key variables which change all the time at the whim of central bankers. And that affects everyone. Explaining that to people is a difficult thing, especially if they've got no idea what Bitcoin is. You can talk to them about it superficially, or, they'll just cut you off most of the time, unless they've actually proactively done some work on this. And normally, I would suggest most folk need to have, experienced some pain before they go down this path, or maybe they've just got an inquiring mind, like a lot of the people. Totally. I mean, I saw a chart of overall asset returns across asset classes a little while back, actually quite a while back, that showed from 2013, probably, or maybe 2012, and basically showed, stocks, bonds, real estate, international equities, broken down into all the various classifications. And Bitcoin was number one for almost every year, except for probably 2 years, maybe 3 years out of 12. And I just thought, why isn't everybody all over this? Why? And I still don't know, but there is a couple of people, who I have to give a shout out to. Pete Dunworth is probably one. Absolutely. Seeing somebody who's a financial advisor, a financial planner, who professionally is right out there saying, what better asset class is there for these reasons, and tell me I'm wrong. And I still see a universe of financial planners who still stick with the 60-40 classic equity bond portfolio, which they've done for 30 years, which I'm sorry is broken now. But they're pretty much saying it's an aberration. And because a lot of them either A, haven't done the work on Bitcoin, which is probably the bulk, or B, worse, are unable to advise on it due to regulation.
Yeah, exactly.
If you talk about your average punter, I actually feel this is quite criminal, that people are not able to get the best advice by actually paying an expert to give them the advice, which is the best of their years and years of knowledge as a professional in this area. I expect that will change, but I can't tell you when. And until then, there's a lot of people who are pretty disadvantaged, in my view.
I agree with you.
Who's to look into the future? Who knows? Anything could happen here. And but look, my views are based on thousands and thousands of hours of research.
Too many.
But that's just
never
on Bitcoin
ends.
and all the stuff prior to it.
100%.
And has led me to my views. And when I look around a room of Bitcoiners who have all reached the same conclusion independently for largely the same reasons from all walks of life, I hear what you're saying about an echo chamber or all drinking the Kool-Aid, but almost all have sort of challenged people externally. Anyone who'll listen, just say, tell me I'm wrong and tell me why.
Yeah.
And because no one's done the work on Bitcoin, they rarely can. The easiest thing they can do is regurgitate mainstream media and say something about tulips or something about scams or Ponzi schemes.
Energy use. That's really
whatever
problematic.
the tale of the day might be.
Yeah, you're spot on. And I think to your point, the financial advisors of today are doing a disservice to their clients by at least not educating themselves. And I think the market will eventually kind of prove those who are sort of behind the curve and those who aren't. So I think it's inevitable. You can't be a financial advisor if you've got this asset class that's sucking up capital from the rest, all of these other areas, and you sort of are deliberately saying it doesn't make sense. I
mean, a client saying to their financial advisor, like, if they were savvy, and you kind of ask the question, if they were savvy, would they really be asking the question of their financial advisor? But I don't say that to be in any way sort of conceited or arrogant or whatever. What I'm if somebody slapped down that same illustration, the one I just said a moment ago, of all the asset classes over a 12-year period, and it's very clear, hello, tell me about this. Why aren't you telling me about that? This seems to be absolutely wiping the floor with everything.
It's true.
Why aren't you talking about that? But is a typical client really going to say that? I don't know.
Probably not.
And I'm not in that position, so it's probably not going to be me. So I just don't know. So it's one of those little conundrums.
Realistically, if I got something wrong, like with my bathroom, let's say I'll get a plumber, I'm certainly not going to be telling him what to do. And I think people treat financial advisors the same.
Absolutely.
So I think therein lies the disservice. I could talk Bitcoin for hours with you, Gary. This is why I brought you on, man. Because you got so much bloody wisdom. It's actually you've got that, because we come from a similar background in terms of the way we've looked at this, investigated it. It's that sort of like value investor side. I want to switch over to the part of the podcast that I really that I'm focusing on specifically, because I think this is where I can add some value, having worked in crypto, so-called crypto, and at least from a publication perspective. And I'm keen to get your take on the sector, in the sense that the way I'm currently looking at it is, you've got effectively Bitcoin and everything else. Within everything else, you've got stuff that is just outright Ponzi's and scams, and then you've got really liquid venture capital software companies that don't even have a product market fit. The only reason people participate in these ecosystems is for the token to go up. Beyond that, there's no real utility here. That's sort of that's my framework, whether it's NFTs or DeFi or whatever. That's kind of where I'm thinking about it. How have you thought about crypto, and what do you typically tell newbies about crypto relative to Bitcoin?
Yeah, so it's a good point. Okay, so there's very few Bitcoiners who I know who haven't gone down that path. When I push the rewind button and tell you, when I started reading books at the start, you get some generic books on crypto, like, what is this? And they take you through a whole heap of stuff. And I'm guilty as charged in the early days. I'll have a bit of that, a bit of that, a bit of that, bit of that. And, you go down that path, and then you sort of do a bit more research. And there's a graph somewhere along the line that shows when you enter the space and you get all those things, and then quickly drops off and you just got Bitcoin. But that's only once you've actually figured out what the other things are.
Yeah.
Because at the start, you probably haven't done the research to figure out, all right, I look at this through a lens of, okay, all right, so is there a company involved? Was there a pre-mine? What's the supply cap? What does this thing do? What's its investment thesis, as I said earlier?
You're asking too many questions there,
I sound like a
that's
rational Richard, don't I?
It's too Richard. It's too Richard.
But it's really easy to get swept up in the hype, and Vitalik and his crew jumping around doing the duck dance on stage and all that sort of stuff. And like the mania and the world computer and all that sort of stuff. But look, I want to sort of look at this quite objectively. I look at it through that lens, but I also sort of look at it through the point of view of, you cannot be so arrogant as to think that everything is solved by Bitcoin. It's easy to do, and indeed many things are, but there has to be some aspects that people are working on that solve possibly other use cases, other things around the edge, which might need solving. But half the time, they're sort of solutions looking for a problem. And me personally, I have yet to see, through my research, anything that would be worthy of attracting my investment dollar in that space, looking at it through that lens, outside of those initial mistakes, because each one of those that I looked at, I soon discovered had pre-mines, had companies behind them, had a good deal of hype or no obvious use case. And so that's why I bailed on them. And I would probably maybe consider myself foolish for being there in the first place, but you kind of live and learn. And so that's sort of the lens that I look at it through. But I don't necessarily discount everything just point blank, because there will be something. I just haven't seen it yet. Not that can compare with what's going on with Bitcoin, especially when you look at it from a layered approach. The real killer for most of the alts is the layers of Bitcoin.
Side chains and layer 2, exactly.
Side chain, layer 2, and layer 3. I mean, there's a lot of stuff which is going on. There's going to be a lot of disruption, and there will be other use cases that perhaps Bitcoin doesn't solve. Fine, put something in that does that. But does it need to be a blockchain? Does it need to be a token? That I can't answer you until we look at the specific uses and the specific circumstances. But I'm more than happy just to say, give me sound money.
Yes, exactly.
Even better when it can be applied to Lightning and attached to this, instantly. Like if you look at what's going on Nostr, where people are zapping left, right, and center, and there's just instant payments which are going between people, and it's almost like there's not an encyclopedia, like a directory of people globally with their bank accounts. Send money to anyone, anywhere now.
Yeah,
that's unbelievable. And not just that, a bearer asset. If you look at it in the context of what I said earlier, and I urge everyone to look up that Jack Mellor's address to Congress, where he drew the very clear distinction between the 27 parties involved in the payment of a cup of coffee using a Visa card, and the banks and the intermediaries and everything like that, as opposed to just bang, accepting Bitcoin, the value has gone straight from you to there. So look, to me, those are burning use cases. There is potential in other spaces, and there's a lot of people who are really great at hyping up the potential. But again, those check boxes that I just outlined are things to keep in mind, because it's easy to get caught up in the hype.
That's a incredibly measured approach. I tend to get a little bit over emotional on this subject, just given the fact that I've just seen inside of it. And I look to myself and I go, you guys are nihilistic, you're soulless, you're dishonest at the core, fundamentally because you're pretending that this thing is decentralized, and it's not. Whatever it is that you're pumping, we know that you control the majority of tokens, and that you raise capital and then you use that capital to market it, and that makes the token go up, and then you offload quietly on your users. And we know that's how it all works. I know that blockchain gaming is an absolute scam, yet there's billion-dollar companies that are here in Australia. There's no reason for any of this to be on a blockchain. But if I were to be charitable, and that's something that sort of my philosophy background might teach me, and that's what you always got to do, you got to steel man your opponent's arguments. In fact, as Charlie Munger would say, you actually got to know your enemy's arguments better than, he's talking about the context of, say, investing in a company or whatnot, but you got to understand the reasons why not you would, why you wouldn't invest. It's exactly the same. So when I think of what you're saying, I go, is there in this universe a conceivable application for any one of these 30,000 tokens? Possibly. Is it from a significance perspective anything close to rivaling our only, I think, the first and last chance we have at sound digital money? I say no. It's a blip. If you think of what Bitcoin can do, it can't do everything, and that's okay, but it solves such a deep problem that exists in society, and the fact that we've got money that's broken, that who really cares what's happening on Ethereum, Cardano? I tend to get really sort of riled up by the likes of Charles Hodgkinson, who heads across to Africa and manages to persuade universities or folks in Africa that somehow this is the right money and not their local currency. And I'm thinking to myself, you've got a government that's controlling the currency. You don't trust it. It's worth nothing. What makes you think that this dork who's created this token has somehow got more value? And so that's the kind of stuff that I find unconscionable. And that's why I actually don't, I wouldn't even want to have a conversation with a so-called crypto advocate, because I go, the stuff you're working on relative to what Bitcoin can do is so trivial that you're not in the same universe. We're not playing the same game.
Yeah. You probably wouldn't feel much better if you read a book. One of the many that I've read is one which Laura Shin wrote called The Cryptopians, which actually was about Ethereum and how it started and who was involved, the sequence of events of how Ethereum came together, who the players were, of which Charles Hodgkinson was one. Before he started, he was the CEO of the Ethereum Foundation for a brief period. I don't know if you knew that, before he started Cardano. And it took you through the whole pre-mine and all of that stuff. But I mean, that's not hype. Those are facts. And as you go through that, it just, as I said, puts these other things into perspective. And don't even talk about the Howey test and, unregistered securities and the definition by the SEC, which there's got a bit of conjecture about it, but the Howey test in the US is pretty clear. That's why Bitcoin is classified as a commodity, and just about everything else is considered an unregistered security. At least that's the way I look at it, just from a sort of a legal framework point of view.
Yeah,
that's the best and most updated info that I have. So take that for what you will, but there's a lot of risk analysis in the context of those items I just outlined.
You're spot on. The regulatory risk is just the beginning, because if I use my sort of legal brain here, I'd say absolutely. I mean, it's pretty self-evident that you've got Bitcoin that stands alone and you've got these other things, and how they will be classified individually is seemingly, it's obvious to me, but I think it's a political issue. So at the end of the day, like, we saw Gary Gensler recently evade the question about whether Ethereum was a security, and yet he was so willing to share his opinion when he was at MIT. And it just shows you, once again, it's all theater, whether it's the regulators, whether it's the politicians. You can't trust a word that comes out their mouth. It's because you think to yourself, like, it's a very simple question. How in God's name is something that was created out of thin air by a bunch of people and allocated, I believe it's between 50 and 70%, but let's run with 50. How is that a commodity? Like, I can just create a commodity out of thin air and then hold 50% of it. But I don't think that this is ultimately going to be a matter for the courts as much as it's going to be like a political matter that's going to be addressed in due course.
I think so.
Yeah, it's getting to that point, but I sometimes lose a little bit of hope in that regard, because it's so bleeding obvious, the distinction. But those whose livelihoods are paid to be ignorant will deliberately ignore it, I guess. That's the kind of way I'm viewing it.
But all right, so cutting to the chase when it comes to Bitcoin versus alts, for me, it's just a series of checkboxes. Fill in the blank or tick the box. Is there a company? Was there a pre-mine? Start there, and you will probably eliminate almost everything. And anything that's remaining, that's when you start going a little further. What's the supply cap? What's the issuance schedule? Because there's a few that go through there.
Have the rules changed?
Yeah, well, that's another really good point, because one of the analysis that I came across was every time Ethereum changes, for example, changing from proof of work to proof of stake, reset the clock.
Yeah, that was Saylor. That was Saylor's. That was Saylor's comment as an engineering solution. It sort of broke,
give it
and then
10
you got to
years.
start again.
Give it 10 years from that particular change of stability, and then you can take it seriously to start evaluating it. But until then you can't. And that's literally part of the lens to look through it. And another thing, just again on the weekend, some normie friends of mine, they were, the usual fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Oh, when will they dream up the next Bitcoin? And I posted this one earlier today, which is quite simply, well, when did they develop electricity 2.0?
Yeah, that's
How'd
new.
that go?
Yeah.
How'd that go? What about the wheel 2.0? How did that go? It's there. It's out of the bag. That's the way I view this.
Yeah.
And I challenge anyone to tell me different. And you can talk about all the alts. And they've got all the forks and all of those other things. The other third one there, which is often used, is the chess tournament. The person comes along to the chess tournament with a new set of rules.
Yeah.
And said, oh, you beaut, we're going to have pawns which can move like a bishop. It's going to be killer. And the chess people look at you and go, what? Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's kind of how I view a lot of this stuff. And until I see something that's different to that, that's the kind of lens that I look at it through. So
I think you've nailed it there, and it's a very rational and reasonable approach, but I would encourage anyone to do the work themselves. Obviously, I tend to be quite biased, and I'm open about it, just given my horrid experience within the crypto world. But as we sort of draw to a close here, Gary, I guess what I'd love to hear is like who are some of the people and what are some of the sources you would recommend people who are just starting to go down the rabbit hole? So they're curious, they're a bit curious, if you like.
Well, first up, congratulations if you've managed to get this far through the conversation and you've still got any interest in what's going on.
I think we lost him at Noster.
We haven't bored you to death. That's another whole side tunnel, that one. Okay, so my suggestion would be start with probably the easy texts. Something like 21 Lessons is a fairly easy book, which you can just look up. I think that's Dojiji. He wrote that one.
Yeah.
Look, I started with the Bitcoin Standard myself, although I did read a couple of crypto books first. But the first solid meat and potatoes one for me was the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous, if it's pronounced correctly, which is just an eye-opener like you would not believe. So you read that. Others might say the bullish case for Bitcoin. There's a couple of key texts there, and just look in the bibliography and just Google what is money reading, or what is money books, what is Bitcoin books, and you will find those books that I just mentioned. And
those are the best places to start, I would say, because I think it's whether it's 21 Lessons, Layered Money, Bitcoin Standard, Fiat Standard.
The Fiat Standard's another cracker, but
so I suppose everyone will
and Knut Svanholm's books. He's outstanding.
Absolutely,
read those. Just Knut, Knut Svanholm, Svanholm is the author. So his books are really good. Everything Divided by 21 Million. The concepts behind it are out of this world. And podcasts. I love podcasts. Robert Breedlove's show, What is Money, the Michael Saylor series. I mean, I personally love listening to Michael Saylor. He's so intelligent, and I think it's a privilege. Some people don't like him for whatever reason, but look, his messages are very clear, concise, and from an engineering, just a large brain point of view. Not everyone can get through it because not everyone's got the patience. But I happen to love it. So Robert Breedlove has got a podcast called the What is Money Show. If you want a lighthearted Aussie one, can't go past the Two Bit Idiots.
Those boys, legends.
Yeah, and Jake, he does a good one as well. But
for sure.
But look, just variety. Like just have different sources and just question your beliefs. Get your conviction. Read as much as you can, listen as much as you can, ask questions, meet some Bitcoiners in real life. That's where the real value is. Find your local meetup all of those things will set you on the path, but it's a path worth taking. Just see which way your brain's wired, but it should be pretty financially lucrative if you're patient.
Yep, and intellectually rewarding. So
and intellectually rewarding, and tons of great people along the way, like yourself, Dale.
Thank you. Well,
just know who you're going to meet.
That's exactly right. And I could talk Bitcoin with you forever, and I'm sure we will at a Bush Bash or the Bush Bash or the Brisbane meetup. But Gary, it's been great to pick your brain and chatting. Really quickly, give us your Twitter handle and tell people where to find you.
Yeah, just I'm a serial poster on Twitter. It's at Gaz Larking, GazLarking. So I'm more than happy to share my thoughts, and I usually do.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, mate. Bye.
All right, so how'd you go with that? I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made sense and that you got some value. If you have any feedback, good, bad, or ugly, or any questions, I'd really like to hear from you. Get in touch via Twitter at Dale21M for 21 million. And if you found the episode useful or valuable in any way, please consider subscribing, giving it a 5-star review, or otherwise just sharing it with a friend. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm not here to tell you what to invest in. I'm simply here to make sure that if you're going to invest in crypto outside of Bitcoin, that you do so with your eyes wide open. Much love, friends. Appreciate you all, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.